Please join me this evening in welcoming Dr. Daniel K. Williams.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank the Georgia Society for the book for inviting me here and making this possible. As Bill said, this is, I think, a timely subject. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book is because I think that this has continued to be a timely subject, despite what we have sometimes heard from the pundits. In the process of writing this book, we passed through the election cycle of 2006. And after that point, there were a number of people who were ready to proclaim the Christian right a has-been. The Christian right seemed to be dead or almost dead, people said. A New York Times article proclaimed the existence of an evangelical crack-up in 2007. The National Association of Evangelicals president, Richard Cizik, said in February of 2008 that up to 40% of the votes of evangelicals were up for grabs. And indeed, E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post said in his 2008 book, Sold Out, quote, "The era of the religious right is over." But then, of course, we had the election of 2008. And even though it was a year of Democratic victory, it was also a year in which there was strong Christian right loyalty to the Republican Party. 38.5% of John McCain's votes, a record number for a Republican candidate, came from white evangelicals. And indeed, 73% of white evangelicals nationally voted for the Republican ticket that year. In the South, it was even higher, reaching a record high of over 90% in Mississippi. And so I think as we see numbers like this and as we see the numbers start to emerge from the elections yesterday, we see a continued vitality of a Christian right that has frequently been proclaimed dead and has then suddenly been resurrected. And so the question is why? Why is there this enduring relationship? Why does the Christian right, despite the rise and fall of so many organizations, and we can think of all the organizations that have risen and fallen over the past 30 years, starting with the Christian Voice and then the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition and then Focus on the Family and so many others that were perhaps minor players in this battle. But the organizations would come and go, and yet the Christian right would endure. And so the question is why? And in particular, why has there been this commitment on the part of evangelicals to the Republican Party? Despite all of the frustrations that so many evangelicals have expressed with this alliance, they continue to come back and vote for the GOP time after time. These were the questions that I wanted to ask in this book, and I was trying to find answers from a historical perspective. There have been pundits who have speculated about some of these things. There have even been political science studies to examine the contemporary commitments, the contemporary partisan loyalties of evangelicals. But before this book, there was really no comprehensive history of the emergence of the Christian right going all the way back to the 1920s. And that's where I begin my story, with a time when America was also facing a culture war, a time of the Scopes trial, a time when people were concerned about flappers, when people were concerned about changes in gender roles, when people were concerned about a rise in illegal drinking despite the existence of prohibition. And what I discovered is that there were culture wars at that point, and the battle lines were drawn in the current fights that we're facing now, some 90 years later. If we go back to the 1920s, it was a time when the fundamentalist movement emerged, that is, a group of evangelicals who identified themselves as fighting for the so-called fundamentals of the faith. And that fundamentalist movement was political from the very beginning. There's a myth out there that fundamentalists were once very apolitical, sitting at home, not really active in politics. But I think from the very beginning, they were concerned about the political process. What changed over time was not their interest in politics necessarily, but their political sophistication, and in particular, their partisan commitment. Because even though in the 1920s, there was this strong belief that America had to be saved from these forces of secularism and forces of change, the fundamentalists really didn't know how to go about doing that in an effective manner. They were divided politically. On the one hand, there were people like Billy Sunday who were very strong Republicans, and people who linked the Prohibition cause with the Republican Party. On the other hand, the leader of the crusade against evolution, or at least the unofficial leader, William Jennings Bryan, was, of course, a Democrat, someone who had run for president 3 times on the Democratic ticket, someone who had been Secretary of State in a Democratic presidential administration. And as William Jennings Bryan told a reporter, he was, quote, both a progressive in politics and a fundamentalist in religion. He urged his fellow Democrats to wage a progressive fight, as he said, to maintain prohibition, while simultaneously attacking the moneyed interests that had, quote, enriched the few and made homeless the many. As he embarked on his campaign against evolution in public schools in the early 1920s, a reporter asked him if he was abandoning his fight for the common man, for the causes that he had believed in his entire life. And he said no, he was continuing his fight, and this time taking out a double-barreled shotgun. One barrel, he said, was aimed at the elephant as he tries to enter the treasury, and the other at Darwinism, the monkey, as he tries to enter the schoolroom. So that was Bryan's belief, that there could be this alliance between Democrats and the fundamentalists. In reality, there was not. The fundamentalists, as I said, were divided along partisan lines and divided along regional lines, with those in the North aligning themselves with the Republicans, those in the South with the Democrats, and ultimately the campaign to keep evolution out of public schools, the campaign to maintain prohibition, and the campaign to keep Catholics out of national politics, all of which were important to the fundamentalists in the 1920s, met with less than full success. And the fundamentalists in the 1930s tended to retreat from politics, at least temporarily. There was a general belief in the 1930s, rather, that the campaigns of the 1920s had been unsuccessful and that America was going to face a coming judgment if it continued to slide into secularism. However, the events of the 1920s forged a political ideology that would reemerge time after time in the Christian right story. The political ideology said that America was in a covenant with God, and it was in the process of breaking that covenant and would therefore be judged if it did not repent. As one fundamentalist pastor stated in 1923 when he was concerned about what was being taught in public schools, quote, "Drive God and his Christ from the educational program of our children, and you have made complete the wrecking of the greatest republic on earth." That belief that the state of the republic depended on its public morality, and that public morality could be enforced through law, would continue to inform the Christian right movement for decades throughout the 20th century and beyond. In the 1940s, the fundamentalists reemerged as a political force, this time under a new name. The National Association of Evangelicals was formed in 1942 by people who had grown up in the fundamentalist movement and had believed that the fundamentalist movement had made a mistake in its political strategy. It had isolated itself. It had not been politically influential enough. And they adopted the new moniker of Evangelical, a name that had been applied quite broadly to many Protestants in the 19th century, and in the 20th century would begin to be identified with this group of people who believed in the inerrancy of the Bible, who believed in the fundamentals of the faith, and who believed, in many cases, in the necessity of defending the faith in the public sphere, including the political sphere. The National Association of Evangelicals opened up a lobbying office in Washington from its very inception in 1942 because they intended to influence the government on behalf of evangelical moral causes. Causes such as the restriction of liquor advertising, or causes such as what was taught in the nation's school system. There was a belief that America was sliding into secularism, and also that the Catholics were gaining too much political power, and that had to be opposed. Alongside the National Association of Evangelicals, other organizations developed to modernize the fundamentalist message. One of those was Youth for Christ, designed to target young people through evangelism, contemporary-oriented evangelism that would make use of contemporary music and lively speakers to try to bring people into this evangelical fold. And one of those Youth for Christ speakers was Billy Graham. Billy Graham would emerge as a political force in the late 1940s and 1950s. He got his start preaching for Youth for Christ in 1944, and then in 1949 he launched his own independent crusade, preaching a message against communism. The world is divided into two sides, Graham said. On the one hand, we see communism. On this other side, we see so-called Western culture. Western culture and its fruits had its foundation in the Bible, the Word of God, and in the revivals of the 17th and 18th centuries. Communism, on the other hand, has decided against God, against Christ, against the Bible, and against all religion. By linking Christianity with the anti-communist cause, Graham was linking the evangelical message with the political message. And in fact, he said, quote, "If you would be a true patriot, then become a Christian. If you would be a loyal American, then become a loyal Christian." And an increasing number of evangelicals in the 1950s would begin to equate the two. They would begin to feel that the government was indeed on God's side because the government was fighting communism, this evil of atheistic communism as they saw it. And they believed that they had a Christian duty to be loyal Americans. Graham went further than this and developed a relationship with particular people in power, and particularly with Republicans. Graham encouraged Dwight Eisenhower to run for president a year before he actually declared. Graham was frustrated, as were many other evangelicals, with President Harry Truman's handling of the Korean War. And he was looking for someone who would take a stronger stance against international communism, and he believed that Eisenhower would be that person. As Eisenhower embarked on his campaign, Graham found other reasons to support him. Graham had a strong belief in civil religion, and so did Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not a churchgoer, or at least a regular churchgoer, before he became president, but he did believe in the importance of religion as a bulwark, a supporter of democracy, of the American Republic. And so therefore, as soon as he became president, at Graham's urging, he joined a Presbyterian church in Washington. He went every week, and he frequently peppered his messages with religious themes. At his inauguration, he led a personal prayer in addition to the prayers that were offered. And he continued throughout his presidency to support legislation that would use the civil religion that America had, this religion of generic theism or Christian-inspired religious ideology, as a protection against communism. So, for instance, in addition to being photographed regularly going to church, Eisenhower also signed into law legislation that added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, that adopted "In God We Trust" as a national motto to be put on the money. And Graham saw this and believed that Eisenhower was leading a religious revival. He gave Eisenhower strong support, as did other evangelicals. 60% of evangelical voters in 1956, according to the best estimates that we have, supported Eisenhower. And Christianity Today magazine polls show that 85% of Protestant ministers supported Eisenhower. So Eisenhower received overwhelming support from evangelicals, and the beginning of a partisan alliance, the beginning of an alliance between the GOP and evangelicalism was beginning to emerge. In 1957, when Graham gave his crusade at Madison Square Garden in New York City and filled the stadium with 100,000 people, Vice President Richard Nixon came to introduce Billy Graham to the audience. Graham was frequently at that point golfing with Nixon, and so it was no surprise that in 1960, evangelicals backed Richard Nixon for president by overwhelming numbers, especially because he was running against a Catholic. But there was also a division that, among evangelical ranks, that hindered the evangelical political influence in the 1950s and prevented a full-fledged Christian right from emerging for several decades. And that was this division between self-identified fundamentalists and self-identified evangelicals. Both could trace their theological lineage back to the fundamentalist movement of the 1920s. But they disagreed on a number of things, including the issue of race. Graham was a centrist on civil rights. He had torn down the barriers that had segregated his audiences in 1953 after running segregated crusades in the South for 4 years. He decided he was not doing that anymore. And so after 1953, Graham insisted on integrated crusades even in the Deep South. Graham also invited Martin Luther King to lead a prayer at his New York City crusade in 1957. But there were fundamentalists who strongly disagreed with that. These people included Bob Jones Jr., president of Bob Jones University, anti-communist fundamentalist broadcasters in the South, people such as Carl McIntyre and Billy James Hargis, and the Christian magazine editor, the Sword of the Lord magazine editor, John R. Rice, as well as emerging stars among fundamentalism, such as Jerry Falwell. And all of these people were self-identified fundamentalists. All of them were strong segregationists. Some of them, including Falwell, actually joined segregationist organizations in the late 1950s and 1960s. And this division between fundamentalists and evangelicals lasted until the late 1960s, and it even divided them at the voting booth. In 1964, fundamentalists supported Barry Goldwater, and many of the evangelicals supported Lyndon Johnson. Temporarily, though, the two sides came together in 1960 to try to fight against the prospect of a Catholic president. When that campaign failed, despite Graham's use of his mailing list of 2 million people to campaign for Nixon, and despite strong Southern Baptist endorsement of Nixon from the president of the Southern Baptist Convention on down, evangelicals had to take stock of their situation, and they began to view themselves as outsiders to the political process. Their great fight against a Catholic president had not succeeded, and as Billy Graham's father-in-law, L. Nelson Bell, wrote to Nixon immediately after the election, quote, "We have felt like a death of a loved one has taken place, not the death of an individual, but the death throes of a nation." At that point, evangelicals regrouped, and they began to fight against the system in a new way. In the 1950s, they had believed that the government was on God's side and on their side. In the 1960s, they increasingly believed that the government was drifting in the wrong direction. That started with the election of Kennedy, but it was then confirmed by a series of Supreme Court decisions and by other changes in the national consciousness that caused them to wonder what had happened to the nation's moral values. 2 Supreme Court cases having to do with religious devotion in public schools, the school prayer case of Engel versus Vital in 1962, and then a school Bible reading case, Abington versus Schempp in 1963, revealed that the Supreme Court was opposed to religious exercises in public schools, was opposed to this traditional expression of civil religion. Interestingly enough, some of the most vocal opponents of the school prayer decision in particular, but the school Bible reading decision as well, were Catholics. Catholics denounced this decision. As Cardinal Francis Spellman said, the decision strikes at the very heart of the godly tradition in which America's children have for so long been raised. Some evangelicals were hesitant to endorse the Catholic point of view precisely because the Catholics had been the ones to raise the point. And so the Southern Baptist Convention actually endorsed the Supreme Court's decision in Engel versus Vital. Other evangelicals, including Graham, criticized what the court had done. But evangelicals again proved themselves divided and unable to meet the immediate challenge of a seeming secular drift. But over the next 5 or 6 years, a series of events would cause the evangelicals to rethink their position and to begin to view secularism as a more potent enemy than Catholicism. Race riots in America's cities confirmed for some evangelicals that society was falling into chaos. It also prompted the evangelicals and the fundamentalists to come together on the issue of race. Fundamentalists moved away from an overt defense of segregation and began, at least grudgingly, to accept the reality of racial integration, but they strongly denounced race riots. Evangelicals discontinued their moderate support of the civil rights movement, and even though they continued to endorse racial integration, they began speaking out quite strongly against the race riots in America's major cities. And so by 1968, evangelicals and fundamentalists had essentially patched up their differences and come together on the issue of race. They'd also come together on other issues such as a denunciation of the New Left, of the counterculture, of the sexual revolution, of the changes in rock music, of the changes in gender roles that were occurring. All of those seem to be alarming events. Both groups were worried about drug abuse, and both groups also found that they started to have a lot in common with Catholics, because conservative Catholics were concerned about these same issues. So in 1968, Billy Graham and a number of other evangelicals, as well as fundamentalists and some conservative Catholics, supported Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the candidate of law and order. He was a candidate who seemed to speak the evangelical language, even though he was not an evangelical himself. Throughout 1967, Billy Graham had been preaching sermons with titles such as Students in Revolt, Conquering Teenage Rebellion, Obsession with Sex, Flames of Revolution, The Shadow of Narcotics Addiction, Rioting, Looting, and Crime. And Nixon spoke to these themes. Nixon promised the restoration of a moral order, and both fundamentalists and evangelicals were attracted to that. And so Graham gave Nixon strong support during the election of 1968, and as soon as Nixon entered office, he realized the power of the evangelical vote and resolved to try to attract that vote again in 1972. And so Nixon started a series of White House church services, the first one of which was preached by Billy Graham. And these White House church services were overtly political. They included the invitations to people that Nixon believed would be good political strategists. When he needed to develop closer relationships with the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, Nixon invited the president of the Southern Baptist Convention to speak at the White House. There was a lot of strategizing in the Nixon White House as to how to reach the evangelicals. And indeed, throughout 1972, Billy Graham regularly met with H.R. Haldeman to go over the president's strategy. How could the president reach out to evangelicals? And that strategy worked. Nixon received more than 80% of the white evangelical vote in 1972. That strategy came at a price for evangelicals. Billy Graham became much less popular among African Americans than he had before. Evangelicals increasingly identified themselves as political conservatives and lost the support of liberals who might have otherwise been attracted to their message. But it did forge the beginning of a new alliance between the GOP and evangelicalism, this time based not only on anti-communism, as had been the case in the 1950s, but based on restoration of a moral order. And that alliance survived Nixon's demise because it was rooted in this deeply felt belief among evangelicals that society was drifting in the wrong direction. And so during the mid to late 1970s, a series of grassroots campaigns brought Catholics, evangelicals, and Republicans together for socially conservative causes. Phyllis Schlafly's campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, or the emerging pro-life movement campaigning against Roe v. Wade, began to bring these various groups together. And evangelicals began to look to a particular theologian to give them some direction in this. Francis Schaeffer was a missionary, a Presbyterian missionary in Switzerland, who had become a leading voice of cultural criticism among evangelicals. He told evangelicals that there was a battle going on, a battle against secular humanism. And nowhere was that more evident than in the case of abortion. And so evangelicals who had perhaps not paid a lot of attention to abortion before 1973, and in a few cases had even endorsed abortion liberalization laws, not believing that life necessarily began at conception, began to come closer to the Catholic point of view on the subject, thanks to Francis Schaeffer's influence. They also mobilized against gay rights. In 1977, Anita Bryant launched the organization Save Our Children after bringing evangelicals together to fight against gay rights in Miami. And this was really how Jerry Falwell got his national political start, was by joining this anti-gay rights campaign in Miami and then going on to California to lead another crusade, another campaign for an anti-gay rights referendum there that, if it had passed, which it did not, but if it had passed, would have made it illegal for homosexuals to teach in public schools in California in 1978. Schaeffer's book, How Should We Then Live?, was all about this fight against secular humanism. And for those who missed Schaeffer's book, and it was widely distributed, but for those who did miss it, there was a more popular account written by Tim LaHaye, who borrowed a lot of his ideas from Schaeffer and wrote the book, The Battle for the Mind, in 1980. LaHaye would later become well known for writing end times apocalyptic novels, the Left Behind series. Jerry Falwell also traced the beginning of his political activism to Schaeffer's influence. And when he launched the Moral Majority in 1979, he modeled that along the lines that Schaeffer had advocated, fighting against abortion, fighting against gay rights, and linking this to an unprecedented degree to a conservative political movement that emerged with the New Right. There were a number of reasons why evangelicals became politically active in the 1970s. One was certainly this fact that they were concerned about what was going on in the nation's cultural drift, the perceived cultural drift, the perceived changes, the rise in the divorce rate, and the rise, as they saw it, of secular influences that they disagreed with. Another factor was the fact that for the first time, evangelicals, Catholics, and fundamentalists were willing to talk with each other and come together. And perhaps a third factor is the fact that evangelicals were advancing socioeconomically. In the early 1960s, only 7% of Southern Baptists had had a college education. By the mid-1960s, 23% had college degrees, which was equal to the percentage of the nation at large that was college educated. Evangelicals had launched massive televangelist empires. In fact, by 1980, both Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were each independently raising more money than the Democratic National Committee was raising. As Pat Robertson said in 1979, we have together with the Protestants and the Catholics enough votes to run the country. And when the people say we've had enough, we are going to take over. So 1980 marked the first time that a lot of people had seen the Christian right mobilize. They mobilized in order to defend their private schools from IRS scrutiny when the IRS was investigating schools for civil rights compliance, investigating the racial composition of schools. They mobilized in order to fight gay rights. They mobilized in order to fight abortion. They mobilized in order to take back the country. And they increasingly linked their campaign with Ronald Reagan. It was interesting that the evangelicals chose to link their campaign with Reagan because, of course, at the time, a Southern Baptist was in the White House, Jimmy Carter. But Carter had alienated many people on the Christian right by consistently taking, in their view, the wrong positions on the culture wars. He had endorsed the ERA, he was moderately pro-choice, he had met with gay rights activists, and evangelicals decided it was time for him to go. The Southern Baptist Convention itself was changing. In the 1970s, it had been politically moderate. After a conservative takeover in the leadership in 1979, the Southern Baptist Convention would very quickly drift to the right. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention had endorsed the liberalization of the nation's abortion laws, had taken a moderately pro-choice position. It had taken a stand against prayer in public schools. After 1980, it would take a very strong pro-life position on abortion, and after 1982, it would embark on the campaign for school prayer. So the nation was becoming increasingly polarized, and Republicans realized that their chance to regain power rested on their ability to appeal to this newly politically mobilized contingent of conservative evangelicals. One of the arguments that I make, though, is that conservative evangelicals became frustrated in their position in the Republican Party because they were never able to really do what they wanted to do. They were never able to get that human life amendment which would roll back abortion in the nation. They were never able to get a school prayer amendment that would overturn Engel versus Vital. They were never able to roll back the tide of gay rights. And so they continued to push the Republican Party further to the right. The Republican Party had to continue to make promises to the evangelicals that it never kept. And evangelicals continued to become restless. There were some who left the Christian right. Other organizations would then reemerge to take their place. And the frustrating thing about the whole arrangement was that evangelicals knew that their public prominence depended on their alliance with the Republican Party. Before they had been allied with the Republican Party, they had gotten nowhere in politics. Their only chance of success came with an alliance with Republicans. And yet the Republican Party also realized that by giving in too much to the Christian right, the Republican Party would become marginalized. We could see those debates, I think, playing out in 2008. I would guess that we'll see those debates playing out again in 2012, because those debates go all the way back to the Reagan administration, when evangelicals first began expressing this frustration over their alliance with Republicans. And yet, in the process, they also realized that that alliance was vital to their goals, and for that reason, they had no intention of leaving a party that, by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, had clearly for them become God's own party. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions. Yes, he did. He got up to give his inaugural address. It was after the clergy had already delivered a prayer, and he got up and he asked permission to then lead his own personal prayer, and then proceeded to give an inaugural address which made frequent reference to God in the fight against communism.
Had it ever been done before?
No.
And not since either?
That's correct. It was, in fact, the use of clergy to deliver a prayer at an inauguration only goes back to the World War II era with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to invite clergy to lead prayers, and that continued throughout the Cold War era. But this Cold War mentality, I think, produced a much closer relationship between religion and politics than had existed before.
Where's the Tea Party in this movement?
Yes, the question was, where is the Tea Party in this movement? The Tea Party, I think, is a fellow traveler with the Christian right, but it's certainly not identical with it. In early 2010, the early part of this year in March, there was a USA Today survey of people who self-identified with the Tea Party, which was about 15% of the electorate. And of those people, 2/3 expressed opposition to abortion, but 1/3 did not, which I think shows the strong libertarian influence in the Tea Party as well as the influence of social conservatives. I think the Tea Party has been portrayed by the media as libertarian in orientation, and indeed many Tea Party activists are. But it's also interesting that a number of their candidates were people who identified with the Christian right. Some of the people who did not win yesterday, such as Christine O'Donnell and Sharon Engel, were very much Christian right supporters. Christine O'Donnell, for instance, had worked in an organization called Concerned Women for America that was started by Tim LaHaye's wife, Beverly LaHaye. It was very much a Christian right organization. Sharon Engel is well known for her anti-gay rights stances, which she continued to reiterate throughout the campaign, and she herself is a Southern Baptist. So the Tea Party certainly has candidates, or had candidates, who identified with Christian right ideology. And I would guess, although we'll have to wait a little while to actually get the poll numbers on this to see how many evangelicals voted in yesterday's election and what their voting preferences were, I would guess that in most of those races, the Tea Party candidates, even when they weren't overtly identified with the Christian right, received strong Christian right support. Rand Paul, who was one of the people who won yesterday in Kentucky, received an endorsement from James Dobson, for example. After Dobson first said he wouldn't support Rand Paul, then the campaign met with Dobson, and Dobson actually gave Rand Paul an endorsement. So I think there is this relationship. They're not identical, but they are working together in close alliance in many cases. Other questions? Yeah. The question is, what is the future of the two-party system? I would say it has a very strong future, and we can base that on the past. In 1980, there was a new right that emerged as an independent political entity. It tied itself to the Republican Party, but it had been working with some Democrats before this too. They essentially wanted to achieve conservative success by any means necessary. They wanted to roll back the tide of governmental growth in Washington. They favored strongly conservative aims. They had some influence. They pushed the Republican Party to the right. But ultimately, people like Wyrick and Howard Phillips and Richard Viguerie, people who were part of this New Right fundraising effort, found themselves politically marginalized in the Reagan administration because they didn't know how to govern. And that was the difference, I think, between the New Right and the Christian Right. The Christian Right made a strategic choice in the 1980s to support the Reagan administration, even when the Reagan administration wasn't doing very much for evangelicals. But they made that choice because they knew that their future was in the Republican Party, whereas the New Right did not. They continued to throw stones and, as a result, eventually passed from political memory. And so I think the test for the Tea Party is going to be whether they can govern. I think the Tea Party made a very wise strategic choice by not running as a third party. Instead, they endorsed candidates who ran in Republican primaries and identified themselves as Tea Party Republicans. I think that was a good choice on their part, not because I'm interested in the Tea Party's success, but simply in terms of looking at how any party succeeds or any group succeeds in the United States. It seems pretty clear that they have to work within the two-party system. In the last 150 years, there have been numerous third parties. All of them have achieved less than full success because this political system that we have is structured in such a way that it seems almost impossible for a true third party to emerge as a viable force except for the short term. And so I think the question will be, can Tea Party members work with Republicans? The Republican leadership, John Boehner, for example, is going to have to exercise this difficult balancing act, and I think he realizes that. Because on the one hand, he's going to be pressured by the Tea Party to move further and further to the right. But I think he also realizes that if the Republicans want to have a legitimate chance in 2012, they're going to have to say no to some of the Tea Party's more extreme aims. I don't expect, for example, a rollback in the 17th Amendment, despite what some Tea Party activists have said. And so I suspect that the people who have come to Washington will learn how to govern, or else they'll find themselves marginalized. Other questions? Yes.
Do you think the Libertarian Party will actually get into the Republican Party like the Tea Party did?
The Libertarian Party, okay, the question was about the Libertarian Party.
Ron Paul did.
Yes. Ron Paul also didn't win in 2008, but
Man, he got some coverage.
he did get a lot of coverage. He also only received votes in the low single digits nationally. I think that's the Libertarian Party's dilemma. Their greatest success at the presidential level as a third party actually came in 1980, and yet it was still well below 5%. And the Libertarian Party, I think, has faced this dilemma. This should have been the year for libertarians, and yet what happened in the gubernatorial race in Georgia, the Libertarian Party candidate received 4% of the vote. That's been the dilemma for libertarians. We could speculate about why that's the case. My own take on it is that the Libertarian Party faces an uphill battle for a couple of reasons. A lot of the people who lean libertarian are so anti-government that they don't bother to vote. And so the libertarians have trouble mobilizing this constituency. And their second dilemma is that for those who do show up to vote, it's very difficult for the Libertarian Party to convince those people that the Libertarian Party is a viable option. People view the Libertarian Party as throwing away their vote. So I think the greatest success that the Libertarian Party could have would be to change the ballot system so that we would have what is used, the type of ballot that's used in Australia, for example, where elections go to an automatic runoff so that people could designate their first choice Libertarian, maybe their second choice Republican. But we're certainly not going to have that at any time in the near future. And so without that, I think the Libertarian Party faces the same dilemma that, say, the Green Party has faced and certainly faced a couple years ago, or other third parties that might attract some degree of support from the general population, and yet for those who are politically engaged, they wonder, is it really worth my time to, in effect, throw away their vote, or at least that's the perception, simply to make a political statement. And if the Republican Party can offer something that many libertarians would support, then they can siphon off votes from the libertarians. Other questions? Question was, the Republican Party has nominated moderate candidates for the last 20 years, so is the Christian right losing its influence in the political process? I guess I would question the premise of whether these candidates are really all that moderate. They seem moderate in comparison with current candidates who might have been running against them. But if you look at Goldwater's positions on the issues would have placed him well to the left of almost any Republican candidate today. And that's actually why Goldwater, at the end of his life in the early 90s, actually endorsed some Democratic candidates. Goldwater was strongly pro-choice, for example. Goldwater was someone who, at the end of his life, endorsed the idea of gays openly serving in the military. He was rather libertarian on those issues. And in 1964, he was viewed as an extremist for a number of statements that he had made, including this alleged statement that he would privatize Social Security, which he denied that he would do. And what happened? Under George W. Bush, not only did the Republicans openly say they were going to privatize Social Security, they actually tried to do it in 2005. And so I think we've actually seen a shift in the political debate toward the right wing of the political spectrum. And I think people would be shocked by just how moderate Reagan was. Reagan at one point, for example, raised taxes. Reagan was someone who was a pragmatist just as much as he was an ideologue. So I think, on the one hand, some of these moderate candidates may not look quite as moderate when in comparison with earlier candidates, just because of the general rightward drift in the country on certain issues. On the other hand, though, I would also say that the Christian right has pushed those candidates to take positions further to the right than they're comfortable with. George H.W. Bush, for example, was someone who had at one point been moderately pro-choice. And because of Christian right influence in the party, he took a pro-life stance against abortion rights. And the same was true for other candidates. Bob Dole wanted to open up the abortion issue and rewrite the abortion platform in the Republican Party so that it would be clear that there was disagreement on the issue in the party. And the Christian right forces led by Ralph Reed blocked that. Similarly with McCain. McCain was viewed as a moderate. He had had problems with the Christian right in the past. And so when he embarked on his presidential campaign in 2006, leading up to the 2008 presidential campaign, he went to Jerry Falwell's Liberty University to deliver the commencement address, knowing he had to get the Christian right on his side. And then, of course, what happened in the campaign? He wanted to choose Joe Lieberman as his vice presidential running mate. People told him you can never choose a pro-choice candidate. So not only did he choose a pro-life candidate, he chose Sarah Palin, someone who caused his poll numbers among evangelicals to go up by 10 points overnight as soon as she was chosen. And she was chosen for one reason: to solidify the base, to solidify the Christian right. And McCain probably needed to do that. He would have probably lost either way. But at least he had a strong showing from the base, from the Christian right. And as I said, nearly 40% of his support in 2008 came from people who were white evangelicals identifying with the Christian right. So yes, it is true that the Christian right has not always gotten their ideal candidate nominated. They never got Gary Bauer, for example. They haven't had an overt Christian right candidate. They didn't nominate Pat Robertson in 1988. But they've exercised enough of an influence to make sure that no presidential candidate since 1980 has received the nomination of the GOP without endorsing a strong anti-abortion platform and without signing on to other Christian right positions as well. Other questions?
I'd like to know about the
That's a great question, and I actually had a slide here that I didn't have time to get into to look at the national vote among Hispanics. First of all, nationally among Hispanics, about 2/3 of Hispanics vote Democratic. But an interesting phenomenon has emerged among the Hispanics who convert to evangelicalism, because only about 2/3 of Hispanics are Catholic in this country today. A large percentage of the remaining group of 1/3 of the Hispanic population is evangelical and particularly charismatic. And studies have shown that when Hispanics convert to evangelicalism, they become much more likely to vote Republican, partly because the churches that they're going to, while they may have Spanish language services and a strong Hispanic element, are also closely tied with the white evangelical movement. And so by moving out of Catholicism into evangelicalism, Hispanics have increasingly begun to identify with Christian right causes. That probably they were socially conservative before, perhaps opposed to same-sex marriage, for example, perhaps opposed to abortion. But maybe they didn't really make that a major issue in terms of their voting patterns. But once they become evangelicals, they do. So I think, I don't have the exact numbers on the percentage of Hispanic evangelicals who vote Republican, but I do know that the Republican vote among Hispanics comes very heavily from that evangelical contingent, and that an evangelical Hispanic is far more likely than a Catholic Hispanic to vote Republican. Yes, the religious makeup of the Supreme Court now consists of Catholics and Jews with no Protestants. The first time in American history when that's happened. I think overall it's probably not going to have a great effect just because the Catholic-Protestant divide no longer really matters all that much. Conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals are far more united, for example, on the political issues than, say, conservative Protestants might be with liberal Protestants or conservative Catholics with liberal Catholics. So the divide on the court is really consists of cultural liberals versus cultural conservatives. And so the four cultural conservatives are all conservative Catholics. Clarence Thomas, for example, Antonin Scalia, the two others who are also on the court, who always vote on the conservative side or generally vote on the conservative side, also have been well liked by evangelicals. So, for example, when John Roberts was confirmed, Christian right gave his nomination very strong support. The same was true with Alito, that when he was confirmed, the Christian right was lobbying on his behalf. The fact that they were Catholic didn't really matter. In fact, it may have helped. People knew on the Christian right that John Roberts' wife, for example, had been active in the pro-life movement. She had been a member of Feminists for Life. They were fairly confident that Roberts would vote their way on the issues that really concerned them, especially Roe v. Wade. On the other hand, we have, on the other side of the court's divide, we have some liberal Catholics as well as Jews who have traditionally aligned with a more culturally liberal approach to Supreme Court decisions and to the law. And so that's really the divide. And that's one reason I think that most evangelicals didn't really say very much about this change in the Supreme Court in terms of its religious makeup. The last Protestant on the court, John Paul Stevens, was not someone that they really liked very much anyway. But I'm sure if there was an evangelical who was nominated for service on the court, that they would give that person very strong backing. Other questions? Yes. Yes, how significant is the evangelical left? People like Jim Wallis. About 25% of white evangelicals support liberal candidates or Democratic candidates, and Jim Wallis would fall in that category. So there's certainly a vibrant evangelical left. It tends to appeal disproportionately to more educated evangelicals, also evangelicals who have, say, a graduate education or who teach at the collegiate level. It also appeals to, this evangelical left also appeals to younger evangelicals. About 2/3 of evangelicals under the age of 30 voted for John McCain, but 1/3 voted for Barack Obama. So there are younger evangelicals and some evangelicals in general who identify themselves with the left. Jim Wallis certainly has a following, But I think, as Democrats have discovered since 2006 and 2008, Democrats have tried to reach out to these liberal evangelicals. They've tried to make alliances with liberal evangelicals on issues of climate change, for example, issues of the environment. And they've had a very difficult time really making significant inroads into the evangelical vote, that it seems that nearly 3/4 of the evangelical vote is pretty much locked up for the Republicans. So I think, yes, it's important to study the evangelical left, and it's important to recognize their influence, and it's important to recognize that not every evangelical is a Republican. On the other hand, it's also important to recognize that that movement has been marginalized in evangelicalism, and I would argue will continue to be marginalized, because despite all of the talk in 2007 about this resurgent evangelical left, it really seemed that there was very little difference between the poll numbers of 2004 in terms of presidential voting and the poll numbers of 2008. And the two midterm elections that we've seen recently, 2006 and 2010, only appear to confirm more of the same in terms of evangelical voting patterns.
Daniel, could you take 2 more questions?
Okay, 2 more questions, especially people who haven't spoken before. I'll go right here. Shifts in the South, I think, partly reflect the mobilization of the Christian right. So the Christian right did have a part to play in this shift in terms of Southern voting patterns, but there were other issues at work as well. The traditional explanation has been that it was race. If you look at when the South started voting Republican, they started voting Republican in large numbers when they were reacting against the civil rights movement. So the story of the South becoming Republican started in the 1950s with Eisenhower's campaign. Eisenhower won the peripheral South, the urban South, and suburban South. And that seems to be because of business interests moving into the South, especially Northerners coming into the South, who viewed the Democratic Party as very corrupt, as backwards. And that was enough for Eisenhower to win a few states on the periphery of the South, Virginia, for example, and Florida. But the real gains in the Deep South started in the 1960s with Goldwater. In 1964, Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Amendment, against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. President Lyndon Johnson supported it. And from then on, it became impossible for a Democrat to win the entire South. The South often divided its vote, but it, on occasion, would vote entirely Republican, as it did, say, in 1972 or in 1984. Then in the 90s, we saw another shift, where the South moved from being simply politically divided, where some states would be won by Democrats and some would be won by Republicans, to becoming overwhelmingly Republican. And that had to do largely with the Christian right, I would argue. Ralph Reed's Christian Coalition did a lot to mobilize Southerners on conservative issues. But also, I think, because of this belief that Reagan represented their values in the 80s, and that maybe Newt Gingrich and the Republicans seemed to have more in common with their values in the 90s than some of the Democrats did. Democrats such as Walter Mondale or Michael Dukakis or even Al Gore in 2000. And so as a result, I think in each election cycle, we're seeing an increasingly Republican South. We're also seeing the South diverging to a greater degree from the rest of the nation. So in 2008, for example, some counties in the South became more heavily Republican than they ever had before, while the rest of the nation was drifting toward the Democrats. And I would argue that if this trend continues, we'll begin to see some regionalized parties where New England is almost exclusively Democratic and the South, at least is Republican for the short term. That may end up hurting the Republican Party, though, because if their future lies among Southern whites and especially voters in rural areas, they're not well positioned for longevity. As the nation becomes increasingly Hispanic, as the nation becomes increasingly urbanized, the Republican Party is either going to have to find a way to reach those other voters outside of the South, outside of rural areas, or else it's going to face a difficult future.